Up until now, I have made over 200 videos on the topic of Seventh-day Adventists and abortion, and this video is by far my favorite and one of the most important, and here is the reason why. Probably nobody alive has done more to influence the way that Adventists think about abortion than Dr. Gerald Winslow, a professor at Loma University. I say the word alive because others like John Stevens and Dr. Jack Pravancia are dead, but Dr. Winslow is very much alive, and for the first time ever, just a few months ago, Dr. Winslow gave a presentation on abortion within the Adventist church, and it was recorded and posted right here to the public for the whole world to see. According to a research paper presented at the meeting of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, it was Winslow who was the dominant figure in the debate to shape the church's position, and it was Winslow who was given the task of writing the initial draft of the church's pro-abortion position. And out of Winslow's own mouth, he stated that the church's position was, quote, ultimately pro-choice, since its bottom line is that the pregnant woman must decide. It places emphasis on the value of life, but this is only limited to persuasion. So Dr. Winslow is the very best. This man right here is arguably the very best that the Adventist church has to offer to defend the teaching on abortion. And since Loma Linda published this online for the public and invited their feedback and comments, let's review what he said. Dr. Winslow starts out by playing a video about the development of a child in the womb. It's important to understand that when leaders in the Adventist church talk about abortion, they always like to affirm the wonderful and remarkable nature of prenatal life. They like to persuade their audience to respect prenatal life. The official position right here states at the beginning, prenatal human life is a magnificent gift of God. God's ideal for human beings affirms the sanctity of human life in God's image and requires respect for prenatal life. And then there's that very important word right there, however. Dr. Winslow, par for the course, wants everyone to behold the wonder of life in the womb, so he shows this video right here. He then begins by sharing scripture, and listen very closely to his choice of words.
The psalmist speaks of being knit together in the mother's womb. It gives us an image that vivifies the imagination. And so that's the one text that I want to start with, because the scripture is not inattentive to the fact that there's a process going on.
He said the scripture is not inattentive to the fact that there is a process going on prenatally. He said it is a process, and listen to what kind of process.
Prenatally. You have many other examples. John the Baptist leaps in his mother's womb when Mary shows up, the cousin, and kind of a down payment on his prophetic future. These stories, metaphors, I do think vivify what we think is going on.
He said these what? These metaphors vivify what is going on. It's just a 9-month metaphorical process. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a term or phrase is applied to something to which it is not literally applicable. He just cited from John the Baptist leaping in his mother's womb and said this is not literal. This is just a metaphor.
These stories, metaphors.
Notice very carefully that throughout the Bible, in both the Old Testament and New Testament, whenever authors referred to the unborn, they always, 100% of the time, defined the unborn as children, sons, babies, and as brothers, with the exact same Greek and Hebrew words used for born children. The unborn are always defined as living human children, but whenever Adventist leaders talk about abortion, they never ever cite from these verses. They never ever affirm the humanity of the unborn. They always like to use phrases like it's a process, or potential life, or prenatal life. When they are forced to address these, they try to deny that this is real or literal. For example, John Stevens, in his book Abortion Controversy, these verses undermine everything that he is teaching, so he makes the claim that these verses are just picturesque and poetic speech. And Kevin Paulson claims that the Hebrew text for children is, quote, merely a symbol. You know, just symbols wrestling in your womb. Winslow does the exact same thing and says this is just a metaphor. It's not literal, which, if that were true, would only create massive problems. For example, when Mary arose and went into the hill country, is that also a metaphor? The hill country, that's not literal. When she enters the house, that's not a real house. It's just a metaphorical house. She spoke with a loud voice. That's not literal. This is all some sort of airy-fairy spiritualized myth. the baby in the womb. The Greek word is brephos. In the very next chapter, a brephos is lying in the manger. Is the manger also a metaphor? Are we now supposed to throw out over 2,000 years of understanding that this is a real, historical, literal narrative and accept the claims by North American abortion-supporting Adventists that this is not literal? It's all just a metaphor. And notice, they never ever tell you where the literal ends and where the metaphor begins. Conveniently for them, it just so happens to be whenever there's a reference to a child. You notice that? Now, in this next clip right here, Dr. Winslow makes what I believe are the most important statements, but in order to understand the significance of what he's saying, it's important to remember that abortion was brought into the Adventist church by the North Americans, and the history of abortion in the USA is critical to understanding Dr. Winslow's presentation. History is the key because the policies today, the laws of the land today, and the teachings about abortion and the consequent attitudes and perception of abortion today are all heavily influenced by the understanding of the history of abortion. In the USA in 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion on demand with Roe v. Wade and the companion case Doe v. Bolton. History is very important because the argument given by Justice Blackmun to legalize abortion was based on a history of abortion law. NARAL was organized and established by abortion advocates in 1969 as the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. In other words, abortion was illegal, and this group was formed for the specific purpose to make abortion legal. Just 4 years later, in 1973, when Roe was decided, Justice Blackmun framed the decision upon an understanding of the history of abortion law, and that history was based on legal briefs submitted by Cyril Means, who at the time was an attorney for guess who? That's right, NARAL, and his quote research was funded from where? Funded by the Association for the Study of Abortion, another group seeking to repeal abortion laws. Cyril Means made two major claims. Number one, that abortion was not a crime in England or America before the 19th century when the Constitution was adopted. And number two, that abortion was criminalized during the 19th century for the sole purpose of protecting the life or health of mothers and not to protect the lives or health of unborn children. The articles by Means and Blackmun's use of them came under such intense and withering criticism that another historian jumped into the mix a few years later. James Moore came out with the book Abortion in America and made two further and somewhat overlapping claims. Number three, that abortion was a generally accepted and common practice in American society at the opening of the 19th century. And four, that 19th century anti-abortion legislation was actually a way for men to oppress women and especially for the organized medical profession to suppress competition from disorganized or irregular practitioners. The entire structure of the legality of abortion is based on these four claims. Let's listen very carefully to what Dr. Winslow now says.
Western Health Reform Institute. Abortion was certainly practiced and much more widely in the 19th century than a lot of people think. Abortifacients were fairly easy to come by, and there were very few state laws making abortion a felony. They started to come in the middle part of the 19th century, and then by 1900 every state had made abortion a felony, largely under the influence of the now burgeoning American Medical Association. Physicians weren't happy about having abortionists doing work that they thought was bad work, and it was largely justified, the laws were justified on safety grounds.
That is amazing because Dr. Winslow cites almost verbatim these four claims from Means and Moore. The only problem is that all four of these are complete myths. They are completely false. And before I show you evidence why they are false, it's important to understand why Dr. Winslow is going over this history. This is a key point.
I'm not sure what Adventists thought about abortion in 1866 when we set up our first healthcare institution.
When he says that he doesn't know what Adventists thought, that's not true because number one, he later admits in this very presentation that he's read research on this very topic. And number two, in just a few moments, you will hear him cite strong anti-abortion statements from Dr. Kellogg. But before he cites Kellogg, he's trying to frame the history in such a way that communicates the idea that any Adventist anti-abortion sentiment was a result of culture and politics and not because of the Bible. The strong anti-abortion statements of early Adventists is a really big problem, so it's important to attempt to frame the history in such a way so that it looks like early Adventists were against abortion for political or cultural reasons and not because of any moral or biblical reasons.
Abortion was certainly practiced and much more widely in the 19th century than a lot of people think.
That is false. The claim that abortion was common or socially accepted is totally bunk. If abortion was so common, then explain why the New York Times called abortion the evil of the age. That's right, the New York Times. How would stories of abortions sell newspapers if they were so common? If it was so common, then where is the evidence? It is almost impossible to get statistics on any 19th century medical procedure that was legal and approved. Abortion was illegal and widely disapproved. Where are the statistics? Dr. Winslow doesn't have any. If it was common, then please explain why we do not find any records of abortions in the private diaries of midwives of the time. According to these myths, the midwives performed most abortions, yet in a remarkably detailed diary of midwife Martha Ballard from 1785 to 1812, during the same time that people insist that midwives were commonly performing abortions, there is no mention of even a single abortion. Her diary includes reports of incest, illegitimacy, child abuse, and other unsavory activities, yet no abortions. It is extraordinary that such a detailed record covering 27 years does not mention it even once. Also, if abortion was so common, then explain the near total absence in the medical records of the time of treatments for incomplete septic abortions. Even Cyril Means, the pro-abortion historian, was forced to admit in his brief that no abortions of any kind were recorded in the records of the New York hospital from 1808 to 1833. If it was so common, then why, of all places in New York, is there no record for a period of 25 years? And that's before the period of anti-abortion legislation.
Abortifacients were fairly easy to come by.
Dr. Winslow is making a very false and misleading statement. Advertisements for abortifacients were in some periodicals sold openly, but almost always through euphemisms. The language in euphemisms reveals that the practice of abortion was not socially acceptable. If abortions were so common and accepted, then explain why most advertisers themselves sold the drugs under pseudonyms or anonymously. If it was so legal and acceptable, then why hide it? And explain why were the products sold in plain, unmarked wrappers as though they were socially disapproved or fraudulent. Explain why reputable doctors, when providing information on how to unblock the menses, told people do not do this if there are any reasons to suspect pregnancy. The entire myth of abortifacients relies upon the assumption that they even worked, that these were effective. Even pro-abortion historian James Moore was forced to admit in his own book the 19th century had no preparations capable of directly producing abortions, though contemporary physicians and the public believed otherwise. And this fact is so damning that Moore buried this in an endnote. Humans today are just as gullible as they were in the 19th century. If what Dr. Winslow says is true, that because something is sold openly, therefore it must be effective, then please explain why he is not promoting shark cartilage, deer antler spray, and drinking your own urine. These are sold openly today and without any euphemism. Do you know why Loma University doesn't promote shark cartilage and drinking your own pee? Because it's stupid, that's why.
And there were very few state laws making abortion a felony. They started to come in the middle part of the 19th century.
Again, that is false. That is not true. Abortion was a crime by common law, and research has been published of ancient records of abortion being prosecuted as a crime going as far back as the 13th century. For example, Rex versus Scharp in 1276, a husband was charged with a, quote, man's death for killing the unborn child of his wife. Just a few years later, in 1281, in Rex versus Code, 3 men were convicted and imprisoned for the felony of killing an unborn child. The belief that abortion was a crime remained consistent for centuries. The status of the English common law at the time that settlers began to arrive in America is highlighted by a case from the year 1602, Regina versus Webb, in which a woman was indicted for self-induced abortion. This was a crime at common law at the very time that settlement of the American colonies was about to begin. There are multiple cases from this time period of people being condemned and punished for abortion. In 1764, jurist James Parker of New York, in his Conductor Generalis, or the Office, Duty, and Authority of Justices of the Peace, recited the English common law of abortion as part of the law applied where? In New York. And all of the cases found thus far in the colonies either support the points made by Parker, or they are even more restrictive. And importantly, no evidence has ever been produced to contradict this conclusion. When people like Dr. Winslow make statements like this, the key point is technology. The statutory laws against abortion followed advances in technology that made it safer for the woman and more effective. Before these laws, abortion was extremely dangerous, and for that reason, it was rare. There are only 3 types of abortion. Injury abortions, where a woman was beaten, punched, kicked, or hit with rocks or poles. The only way to end the pregnancy was to injure the mother so badly that she herself could barely survive and often did not. That's why abortion before the 18th century was tantamount to suicide. In 1793, this French journalist wrote right here, the danger that an abortion always poses a mother will make this a what? A rare crime. The second method of abortion, ingestion of poisons. Again, not only do pro-abortion historians admit these were ineffective, but surveys of medical literature in early societies supports the conclusion that the potions ingested in attempts at abortion were ineffective, highly dangerous, or both. Dr. Carl Gerasi, Sanford professor of chemistry in the New England Journal of Medicine, mocked people as naive who think that these primitive potions would ever function as effective abortifacients, and that's saying something because Dr. Gerasi, because of his work creating the birth control pill, was nicknamed the father of the pill. The third type of abortions were intrusion techniques, which are very common today. However, the technology to do then what is done today, number one, did not exist, and when it was developed and more widely used in the 19th century, still remained extremely dangerous. It's important to remember that this was a time before analgesics, before anesthetics, before antiseptics, and before antibiotics. All surgery was dangerous, and especially abortion. For example, the simple but very important idea of wearing gloves during surgery was not even introduced until 1899 by Dr. William Halstead of Johns Hopkins University. What pro-abortion historians like to do is to lead people to project into the past the conditions and technology available today, and to prove the point further, abortion advocates today hold up coat hangers and argue that if abortion were made illegal, it would force desperate women to have dangerous abortions, which only proves the point that advanced technology is a necessity to make abortions safe for the woman. Another reason for the structure of abortion laws was because of no way of even confirming that a woman was pregnant. There were no sonograms, no checking blood samples, no pregnancy tests. There was nothing. There was no forensic medicine or CSI crime labs. For the purposes of the law, it was very difficult to prove that the child was alive and that it died by the act of abortion. This was a question of forensic medicine, not of criminality. There's so much more that can be said on this point. Moving on.
And then by 1900, every state had made abortion a felony, largely under the influence of the now burgeoning American Medical Association. Physicians weren't happy about having abortionists doing work that they thought was bad work.
That is absolutely not true. That is false. The proponents of abortion prohibitions always advanced the protection of unborn life as the primary reason for the statutes, and if they even mentioned it at all, treated protection of maternal health as a secondary reason. And you can see for yourself right here that the physician who most influenced New York's earliest abortion legislation wrote about abortion as a form of infanticide. Other physicians who campaigned against abortion termed the practice feticide rather than abortion because their primary concern was to protect the child from being killed. Furthermore, any claim that the regular physicians were motivated to eliminate competition has never been substantiated. No one has ever turned up even a smidgen of direct evidence of such a plan or program, either in the early years of the 19th century or later when the abortion statutes were first enacted or when progressively more severe prohibitions were imposed. And here's a great question for Dr. Winslow. Winslow, if, as he claims, that the American Medical Association was concerned about, quote, bad work by irregular physicians, then please explain why there is no evidence of irregular physicians perceiving anti-abortion legislation as a threat. Explain why they did not attempt to prevent enactments of abortion provisions. The major rivals to the allopaths were the homeopaths. Explain why the homeopaths in the later years of the century joined the allopaths in their condemnations of abortion.
And it was largely justified, the laws were justified on safety grounds.
Again, that is false. Someone said those who can't remember the past are condemned to trust historians. The only reason that Dr. Winslow can get away with making so many false statements is because people are unaware of the history. You can pick any anti-abortion tract at random from the 19th century and find arguments to protect the unborn child. The evidence for this is so overwhelming that even pro-abortion historian James Moore was forced to admit, page 164, that the belief that abortion was morally wrong was, quote, no doubt sincere. For anyone who is watching this video who is unfamiliar, there is a huge difference between a mother's health and saving a mother's physical life. These very same doctors who spoke against abortion also thought it was okay in order to save the mother's life, because that is not intentional. And when two people are drowning and you can only save one, you do the best you can to save one and try to save the other as well. Abortion on demand was legalized in 1973 using the mother's, quote, health clause, which was defined so broadly as to include mental health, emotional health, social health, or anything that affects her, quote, well-being. In the 19th century, when anti-abortion legislation was passed, the statutes denominated the crime against the unborn child as manslaughter, murder, or assault with intent to murder. And most of these statutes referred to the victim as a child, not as a fetus. Additionally, there are no less than 44 appellate court decisions representing some 32 states, including Texas, who stated in one form or another that protection of conceived unborn human life was one purpose of the state's statutory criminal abortion scheme. And this point right here, 14 of 27 states provided for a higher range of punishment if it were proven that the attempted abortion caused the death of the fetus. The significance of the statutes providing for an increased range of punishment if it could be proven that the attempted abortion caused the death of the fetus is obvious. The death of the fetus is totally irrelevant to the health of the mother. Dr. Winslow is repeating the falsehood that anti-abortion laws were for the health of the mother. But if that were true, there would be no reason for legislators to assess a greater punishment if it were proven that the child was killed. The only explanation for this is that lawmakers attributed value to the life of the unborn child.
And then by 1900, every state had made abortion a felony.
Today's climate in the USA proves a very important point. Many states are trying to make abortion illegal, like Alabama, and several states are trying to protect access to abortion, like New York, which proves that attitudes and beliefs are very divided. So a question for Dr. Winslow: if abortion was so common and so socially acceptable in the 19th century, then please explain why anti-abortion legislation was accepted unanimously throughout the states. The very same states who were terribly divided on slavery were not divided at all on abortion. Here is a map of the slave states versus free states. Now check this out. When lawmakers passed anti-abortion legislation, here are a few examples of the voting record. Alabama House 26-0, Senate 83-0, New Jersey Assembly 44-0, Senate 14-0, Tennessee House 80-0, Senate 23-0, Michigan Senate 22-1, House 78-0, Kentucky House 84-0, Senate 27-0, Illinois House 63-0, Senate 24-0, etc., etc. If abortion was so widely practiced and socially accepted, then explain why anti-abortion legislation passed with little to no resistance at all. Dr. Winslow frames the history as if only this group of physicians of the AMA were against abortion, but the fact is that every recognizable social group in society opposed abortion, including doctors, lawyers, clergy, journalists, and one other group. There is one other group that was very outspoken against abortion, and pro-abortion historians do everything they can to avoid drawing any attention to this group. Do you know who it was? Feminists. Feminists. The leading feminists of the 19th century were virtually unanimous in supporting the prohibition of abortion as a crime because of a professed concern to protect prenatal human life. They openly condemned abortion as antenatal murder, child murder, or antenatal infanticide. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth C. Stanton, Matilda Gage, Victoria Woodhull, and not just feminists, but female physicians also condemned abortion. Dr. Mary Dixon Jones, a gynecologist in 1894, called abortion a holocaust. A great army of little children are destroyed. Abortion was described as a holocaust when Hitler was only 5 years old. Not only was Kate Lindsay a physician, but she was the first female Adventist physician who wrote in her lectures. Add to this the fact that the mother must gratify the perverted sexual passion of the husband all through pregnancy, and that she has spent her time planning to murder it before birth, for it is often an unwelcome child. And check this out, Loma Linda University named their women's dorm after Dr. Lindsay Hall. So Dr. Winslow is defending abortion just feet away from a memorial to a female Adventist physician who condemned abortion as murder. See if you can figure that one out. Anyone seriously interested in learning more about the history of abortion should read law professor Joseph Della Pena's Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, 1,300 pages, 2,000 case citations, and 9,000 carefully documented footnotes completely devastating these myths by Winslow.
What we should make of Ellen White's silence on abortion, because there were others in her day who were certainly not silent, and I'll give you an example in the next slide.
Again, that is false. Ellen White was not silent, but followed the language of the Bible in defining the unborn as children, and it's wrong to kill children. 2. Ellen White never used the word rape even once. Does that now mean we should be silent about rape? The writers in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, never explicitly condemned slavery, even though it was common. Does that now mean we should be silent about slavery? Every student of the Bible knows that you can make any outrageous claim you want based on silence. Not only is silence not an argument, but number 3, Ellen White displayed deep concern for the health of unborn children and urged the necessity and importance of positive prenatal care. So, question for Dr. Winslow, in light of her explicit statements, would you please explain how dismembering a child is positive prenatal care? And Adventist pioneers J. N. Andrews, James White, J.H. Wagner, Uriah Smith, Dr. Kellogg, Dr. Horatio Lay, E.J. Wagner, Dr. Kate Lindsay, all of them condemned abortion as murder. Ellen White was surrounded by leaders and pioneers who openly and publicly denounced abortion as murder, yet there is nothing from Ellen White rebuking them or telling them to be silent. Why is that? Every drop of strong drink taken by a pregnant mother to gratify appetite endangers the physical, mental, and moral health of her child and is a direct sin against her creator. And so Ellen White condemned women who drink alcohol during pregnancy. But notice, the intent is not to kill the child. The intent is to simply gratify appetite. Now notice the hypocrisy. Ellen White condemns negligence that would unintentionally hurt an unborn child, but we are now supposed to believe that intentionally, deliberately killing that child is something we should be silent about. That is completely absurd. To claim that Ellen White was silent is to imply that her audience is so stupid that they need her to explicitly tell them, do not kill innocent children. This is to imply that we need her to tell us every single thing that we can and cannot do because we are mindless automatons who cannot reason from her writings. That is absurd.
There were others who spoke, and John Harvey Kellogg spoke with great vigor.
Dr. Winslow now shares a strong anti-abortion quote from Dr. Kellogg, but I want you to listen very carefully to what he says next about Kellogg. Pay very close attention.
In his book, I think it's the one on women's health, he describes a married woman with children who came to him asking for an abortion, and he said to her, look, this can be very dangerous. Why would you want to risk depriving your children of a mother? Why don't you just get a gun and shoot one of your existing children and then go ahead with this? That way you'll have the same number of children and you won't risk depriving them of a mother. So I don't know what you think of his bedside manner, but he told that story about himself.
Did you hear that? Dr. Winslow says that a woman came to Kellogg asking for an abortion, but Dr. Kellogg said it would be dangerous. Why don't you just shoot one of the children you already have? And then Dr. Winslow jokes about his bedside manner and everyone starts laughing. Well, if you go online right now and find this story, it's in the book Ladies' Guide in Health and Disease, and on page 356 is the story. Some years ago, a man came asking that his wife get an abortion. We promptly gave him a negative answer and tried to persuade the man from both a professional and a moral standpoint. He was persuaded, and he said that he would have his wife come visit. The woman later shows up, wants an abortion, and says that she should certainly employ someone else if we did not consent to do it. Listen to these words right here. We promptly assured her that if the operation was performed at all, it must be done by someone else besides us, and at once began to lay before her some considerations calculated to do what? To divert her mind from her purpose. Our most what? Our most earnest arguments and appeals seemed to have no weight with her. So at last, he tells her that it would be safer for her and make more sense to just kill one of her born children. The crime would be in no sense a greater one, and would not be so great in one sense, since if an abortion is produced, the result may virtually be suicide as well as murder. So far as the child is concerned, it is murder in either case, and one of the most cowardly kind, since it is taking advantage of the weakness and helplessness of a human being unable to defend itself, an act which is seldom equaled in atrocity by the most heartless assassin or even the barbarian captor. The woman hesitated for a moment, but then got up and left, stating that she would just find someone else. Do you see the difference? Dr. Winslow told the story as if the only thing that Dr. Kellogg did was warn her of the danger and urged her to just get a gun and shoot one of her born children. However, in the actual story, it's not just Kellogg, but also those with him who did everything in their power with, quote, earnest arguments and appeals to persuade this woman, and only after she refused did he try a different argument. And even then he said this is murder of the most cowardly kind and pleads on behalf of the, quote, weakness and helplessness of a human being unable to defend itself. Dr. Kellogg did everything in his power to persuade this woman because he knew that if she walked out of his office, that little boy or girl in the womb would soon be violently ripped to pieces. But Dr. Winslow is entirely dishonest by ignoring the beginning and ending of the story. He lifts out just one section, gives a distorted, manipulated view, and implies that Kellogg is some unconcerned, unbalanced fanatic, and then he has the audacity to stand there and joke about Kellogg's bedside manner.
So I don't know what you think of his bedside manner, but he told that story about himself.
That is despicable and shameful. Kellogg's story, however, is also very helpful because, as we saw, Dr. Winslow claims abortion was made illegal for health reasons, but Dr. Kellogg blasted abortion as a heinous sin and the most unnatural, most inhuman, and the most revolting of all the crimes against human life. The crime should be considered a just cause for church action to disfellowship. This is important because if what Dr. Winslow said about the other physicians were true, then this proves that Adventists condemned abortion also for moral reasons. This is important because Dr. Kellogg proves the point that abortion was extremely dangerous and tantamount to suicide. In fact, Kellogg wrote so much against abortion that historians today who write about this period cite from Kellogg. The leading, most well-known Adventist physician is remembered today for speaking so strongly against abortion, and the leading, most well-known Adventist ever, Ellen White, is remembered for her strong emphasis on protecting and caring for unborn children. Adventist pioneers unanimously defined the unborn as living human children. Adventist pioneers Andrews said this was murder. James White said it was murder. J.H. Wagner, Uriah Smith, Dr. Kellogg, Dr. Horatio Lay, Dr. Kate Lindsay, all condemned abortion as murder. Yet isn't it odd, don't you find this odd, that Winslow would only cite from just one person when there are so many other examples? Why would he do that? Not only did they condemn abortion as murder, they openly condemned other Protestant denominations for supporting abortion. Again, why didn't Winslow state that fact? Are we supposed to assume that Dr. Winslow, with his advanced education and with his access to all those databases, libraries, and resources, that somehow he could not find this information? Just couldn't find it. Adventist pioneers openly published anti-abortion sermons from non-Adventists and showed support for anti-abortion legislation. Here's an amazing fact. The Adventist Church was officially established in 1863, and just 4 years later, in 1867, Uriah Smith published an anti-abortion sermon in the Adventist Review and Herald titled Fashionable Murder. In 1869, J.N. Andrews condemns abortion, a few words concerning a great sin, again in the Herald, and in 1870, James White says abortion is murder, a worse than devilish practice. Now, as you listen to this next clip, remember those years, 1867, 1869, and 1870.
I'm not sure what Adventists thought about abortion in 1866 when we set up our first healthcare institution.
Wow, he doesn't know what they thought. That's truly amazing. Even though we were a very small denomination facing so many challenges, Adventist church leaders wanted to make it very clear that in no way did they support or condone the killing of an unborn child. Adventist pioneers made it very clear from the beginning of our church history that we would not support abortion, and yet Dr. Winslow is somehow unaware of all of this. That is truly amazing. I'm just so amazed. When talking about slavery, when talking about tobacco, when talking about alcohol and temperance, Adventist leaders always know what the pioneers thought. But on abortion, it's a great big mystery. Isn't that amazing? It's truly amazing. It's 2019, and all of this can be found online in a matter of minutes. But somehow Dr. Winslow, he's just not sure. I am really amazed. For those that don't know, a big influence in Adventist acceptance of abortion was a Dr. Jack Pravancha, a theologian from guess where? That's right, Loma Linda. Dr. Winslow spends some time here talking about Pravancha's essay, The Christian Approach to, quote, therapeutic abortion. I actually have the book with the essay right here, and I'll address this in a separate video. However, I do want to give you an idea of what kind of ideas are in this book, one of which is called a graduating scale, and this may surprise you, but he claims right here in the book that you are not a human until the instant that you become responsible. Anyone with half a brain can see that when you define someone as a human only when they are responsible, this opens all sorts of problems. For instance, who determines who is responsible? What if people disagree on what makes someone responsible? This type of thinking is completely insane. There is no objective standard at all, no objective definition. It's completely subjective. It, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with the Bible. How would you like to live in a world where whether you are a human or not depends on whether or not someone else thinks that you are responsible? Pravancha also says other crazy things like the child is just a symbol with symbolic value. Sometimes a fetus as symbol must be sacrificed because of its threat to the humanness, to the quality of life of its mother. Listen to what Dr. Winslow had to say.
This means that one seriously competes with rather than serves that to which it points we must be prepared to sacrifice this symbol. I mean, it's in other words, it's good to place a lot of emphasis on the flag, but and people do die for the flag. But if the flag is not serving the purpose it was intended for, you may need to sacrifice the flag. At least that's the way I would read it.
Again, that is false. He is specifically talking about abortion, but he uses the flag, a flag, as an example of a symbol. The difference is that unlike a flag, a child's purpose is dictated by God and not by man. That is totally false. Another problem is that he then talks about George Gaynor. The most well-known paper about abortion within the church was this one right here, The History of the Abortion Guidelines by George Gaynor, that was later published in Ministry Magazine. Now, listen very carefully and pay attention to what he says.
A person who's been highly critical of all of this is George Gaynor. I don't know where George Gaynor is. When he wrote this, he was a chaplain, I think, at Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist University. But he, in a variety of places, and in this case Ministry Magazine, he has published about the history of all of this, and I must say, done a very thorough job. I have the article if you want to see it, and it's cited here. But
wow, that is amazing, because just a few minutes ago he said he has no idea what early Adventists thought about abortion. That's really amazing, because he just stated right here that George Gaynor did a, quote, very thorough job. And on the very first page right here, George Gaynor specifically cites from early Adventists opposition to abortion, and there are the quotes right there from 1867, 1869, and 1870, and those are just 3 of many more. Dr. Winslow says that he has no idea, but he then admits that Gaynor did a thorough job, and he even says that he has Gaynor's paper. So we have a problem. What are we to conclude about a professor of ethics who stands there and says he doesn't know what Adventists thought, when he then admits just a few minutes later he's fully aware of Gaynor's paper, who cites repeatedly from early Adventists? And even if he did not have Gaynor's paper, Dr. Winslow also admits that he was one of the presenters at the 1988 Loma International Conference on Abortion, where guess who else spoke? That's right, George Gaynor. So Winslow has both the paper and he was present when Gaynor's research was presented. Yet 30 years later, he still has no idea. That's totally amazing. Someone sent me the original list of participants, and there's Gaynor's name right there, number 21, and oh look, there's Winslow, number 61. So at best, this is extremely sloppy scholarship. Now in this next clip, you are going to hear him say that making decisions about abortion involves a weighing process of different values, and then listen very carefully to how he describes people who do not follow this idea.
Because for me, as I said in that article and have believed all the time, is there's not just one value at stake. There are competing values and there is a weighing process. And I want to say more about that in just a little bit. In order to carry on bumper sticker thinking, you have to minimize everything that's valuable on the other side, at great risk to your own moral integrity. To be morally mature is to realize there are a number of values that compete for our attention, and we have to live with the reality that there are times when we will have a moral dilemma. And that's not an argument between us and somebody else.
He said that if you engage in any type of thinking that does not entertain these differing values, then you risk, quote, your own moral integrity. Definition of integrity: honesty, the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. According to Dr. Winslow, if you do not accept his way of thinking, then that is dishonest. And he said, quote, to be morally mature is to realize there are a number of values that compete for our attention. So not only dishonest, but also immature. That is very misleading, because as Adventists, we may very well be aware of all the different values throughout the world and the varying cultures and value systems. But as Adventists, we believe the ultimate authority is the infallible Word of God, which defines the unborn as living human children and are therefore protected by the 6th commandment. To profess to the world that you are an Adventist is by definition to profess to the world that the Bible is the authoritative source of truth, and nowhere does the Bible define the unborn with such vague, ambiguous concepts as potential life or as a symbol or some crazy graduating scale. The unborn are always defined as whole, complete, living human beings. And to make it worse, when Dr. Winslow does present his differing values, they refute the very argument that he tries to make. For example, in several of his articles on abortion, he claims respect for personal autonomy. Out of his own mouth, he states, much of what we mean when we say that we respect a person is that we are unwilling to do what? To restrict his or her autonomy. Or here, he goes further and tells the church that it should not support efforts aimed at restricting the personal autonomy of the pregnant woman. Yet in these very same articles, he writes repeatedly that abortion for reasons of convenience and expedience are morally unacceptable. This is completely false, and here's the reason why. When you make a claim for personal or bodily autonomy, then by definition, you cannot have any restrictions. If you claim, as Winslow does, that a woman has freedom to exercise bodily autonomy, then you cannot trample upon that autonomy and impose restrictions upon her. By definition, the personal autonomy argument necessitates extremism and allows a woman to have an abortion for any reason she desires, whenever she wants, however she wants. To make it worse, those in the Adventist church like Winslow who defend abortion go even further and claim that this freedom is religious in nature. Listen to this.
So it's not just one value. And to tell a person what that person is going to do with his or her own body is to run into very sacred territory.
I do not need to make any of this up. There it is, out of his own mouth. Imposing restrictions is to run into what? Into very sacred ground. As Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that religious liberty is the freedom to worship. If you want to worship as a Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Catholic or Baptist, you have the freedom to do so, and we will defend your freedom. If you want to worship SpongeBob SquarePants, then you have the freedom to do so. Religious liberty is the freedom to worship according to your conscience. If a leader in the Adventist church stood up and said that we need to place restrictions on how some Hindus prefer to worship because we don't like how they worship, that would be a violation of religious liberty. Even if it was only one restriction, that would still be wrong. Dr. Winslow and others, in an attempt to convince Adventists to accept abortion, have claimed that abortion is a religious liberty issue, and that's why he says it's very sacred ground. Listen carefully and tell me what is the name of the magazine that he quotes to support his statement.
Yeah, Ellen White says, in reasons of conscience, the soul must be left untrammeled. Old-fashioned language, but the point's the same. You get to decide. And that's very strong. That's why we publish a magazine called Liberty.
That's why we publish a magazine called Liberty, which is the leading magazine on religious freedom. Official definition, religious liberty entails freedom of conscience to do what? To worship or not to worship. Again, here it is out of their own mouths. The people in our church who wrote the pro-abortion position, the people who crafted this language, the people who defend abortion openly without any hesitation, they very strongly claim that abortion is religious in nature. This is sacred and it must be defended as religious freedom the exact same way that we defend religious freedom of the Sabbath. I share this to prove a very important point. Dr. Winslow has for almost 40 years claimed that killing an unborn child is a religious liberty, that this is a matter of personal autonomy, which by definition cannot be restricted. Yet, in open denial of his claims, the church has stated right here, abortions for reasons of birth control, gender selection, or convenience are not condoned by the church. If abortion is truly a matter of conscience, then you cannot have these or any other restrictions. For example, if this is truly about personal autonomy, then you cannot tell a woman what to do or not do. You cannot restrict her in any way, any more than you can restrict the Buddhist in his worship. If a woman says that she wants an abortion because the baby is black, or if she only wants half an abortion, she wants the arms and legs ripped off so that the child is born deformed, as hideous and horrible as that sounds, the moment that you claim that this is a freedom of conscience issue, you cannot say no.
To tell a person what that person is going to do with his or her own body is to run into very sacred territory.
Nobody needs to refute Dr. Winslow's arguments because he refutes himself. His statements are completely contradictory. You cannot have both autonomy and restrictions at the same time. This is true for the bodily rights argument by itself, but by adding the religious element, which he does by claiming this is a religious action, he has put himself into an impossible and absurd position. And to make it worse, he claims that certain types of abortions are, quote, morally unacceptable. Oh yeah? Says who? When did Dr. Winslow become the judge of right and wrong, what is moral and not moral? Who does this guy think he is? As a professing Adventist, he should be providing scripture, but of course he does not because he cannot. This man has the audacity to tell the church that we should not support efforts aimed at restricting personal autonomy, but that is, in fact, the very thing that he himself supports in this very same article. Listen again to his point that he made right here.
But he doesn't stop at any of those places, including live birth. He says you become a human when you're responsible. Now, he acknowledges that that could lead to something you're all thinking about, and that would be the horror of infanticide.
He cites from Pravancha, but even Pravancha himself admitted right here in Ministry Magazine, we quite legitimately refuse a woman absolute rights over her newborn infant. She has no what? No what? No freedom to destroy it or even to abuse it. The newborn has a say, even if the rest of us temporarily have to speak for it. Winslow stands there and tells everyone about the horror of infanticide, the horror of killing a newborn baby, while in the very same breath, he defends a woman's, quote, freedom to kill that same child before it's born. According to Winslow, if the baby is born at 9:37 in the morning, you can't kill it. And if you even abuse it, you should go to prison. But according to them, if you just get there 60 seconds earlier and violently dismember it at 9:36 in the morning, oh, that's freedom of conscience. And that brings us to the jugular question. What is the biblical principle that distinguishes a baby born 2 months premature from a 7-month fetus, making it a crime to kill the first, but merely an exercise of personal freedom to destroy the second? That is the jugular question. That is the question he cannot answer. That is the question which exposes this as completely absurd and false. By asking one simple question, this whole house of cards crashes to the ground. Let's listen to one more.
Am I pro-life? Firmly, resolutely, yes. I like living. I'm in favor of it. I find abortion to be a tragedy, and sometimes an avoidable tragedy. On the other hand, I'm pretty stoutly for choice.
There it is, the textbook I'm pro-life, but also pro-choice. Again, that is completely false. Adventists who defend abortion, or Adventists who know that this is wrong but are too scared to say anything, are notorious for claiming that they are pro-life but also pro-choice. This is impossible though, because that little child, that innocent boy or girl, is going to die or they are going to live. There is no halfway between life and death. It is a life or death situation. To claim otherwise is a denial of our belief about the state of the dead. Ever since our Adventist church accepted abortion in 1970 and 71, for over 49 years, leaders and people like Dr. Winslow have played the role of magicians who, using words, try to create the illusion that we can play both sides. They wave their verbal magic wands, hoping to cast a spell over your eyes that we can be neutral, but neutrality is not an option. And to prove that point, out of Dr. Winslow's own mouth, he himself admits that at the end of the day, the church had to decide between life and death, and they chose death. The church does, in fact, support the deliberate, violent destruction of little children. I am so glad for this presentation. This is great. Praise God. I am thankful because Dr. Winslow is the very best that the church has to offer in defense of abortion, and he himself has put on public display that it's all a complete fraud. Dr. Winslow is the brains behind these guidelines, and his presentation is just one false statement after another. He openly denies Scripture. He pretends as though he knows nothing of Adventist history when he himself then admits to having the very best source available right in front of him. He completely misrepresents the history of abortion. He makes illogical claims that a child is just a symbol equivalent to a flag. His own system of values are self-refuting. He makes the outrageous claim that killing a child is a matter of religious liberty, just like the Sabbath. He impugns the character of Dr. Kellogg by giving us a false, manipulated view of the actual record, and then he makes jokes about it. How in the world can you call yourself a professor of ethics when you do this? And he wants to lecture everyone else about being morally mature.
Especially in an Adventism that may be exhibiting some unusual authoritarian tendencies lately.
He complains that there are, quote, authoritarian influences in the church when he himself wants to be an authority and tell the church what we should do. We should not restrict women who want to kill children when he himself supports restrictions. He misrepresents Ellen White as though she said nothing about how to care for unborn children, and then he has the audacity to spin the terrible story or stories of two women who were bleeding to death and dying in order to paint himself as a victim who is, quote, often criticized. Dr. Winslow said that in a life and death situation, when these women were in fatal danger, a decision was made to end the pregnancy, and it was traumatic and agonizing for these women to lose that child. This was an unintentional emergency situation, but he is using their story in defense of abortions that are deliberate and intentional, and yet he has the audacity to lecture everyone else about moral integrity. Again, I am so thankful for this presentation. Thank you so much. I have made over 200 videos on the topic of abortion in the Adventist church, but this man has accomplished more in 45 minutes to destroy and refute this teaching than anyone else ever. I truly believe this, that if Dr. Winslow had just continued to remain silent, he would still have much of the same influence. But now that he has spoken, everyone can see that not just some, not just a few, but all of his arguments are sloppy, inaccurate, immature, false, distorted, and self-refuting. And this comes from the very best that the church has to offer. So again, thank you so much. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much.